Very nice. So we now come to the final panel and closure of this WPRN 21 conference, and we have the pleasure of having very distinguished scientists with us. Of course, I take myself out of the lot, but I was, kindly invited to contribute to this. And this panel is about where we're going next. And if you think a little bit, this is probably the first time in history there is a global, massive, synchronous outburst of research in social science and humanities on a global issue. Usually such research is local, partial, often delayed in time, but this time it wasn't. Natural sciences, of course, have also reacted globally and fast, and they have produced a very visible output as vaccines, for example. But us here on social science and humanities in this conference, we have heard and discussed research about the impact of the pandemic on societies, on organizations, and individuals. And we have also heard very useful reflections on how doing research on and during a crisis have impacted the very process of research. And I think this is probably what we should discuss in that panel of where we go on from now as a community, not anymore discuss more results on the content of what we have found, but on the process and how we can do better now and next time. And indeed, we have to improve. For example, in some of the talks I've heard, like Tia de Bruchy from South Africa, she noted that when we read some research papers or blog entries written by scientists at the beginning of the pandemic, when we did not know much about COVID, well, we can now, in hindsight, think that perhaps it would have been better if these papers had not been published, which is embarrassing. I mean, the pressure for publication has produced a number of half-baked papers, and time and energy has been wasted that could have been used to prepare solid longitudinal and comparative studies. In a way, science should not become some form of journalistic competition, whatever career pressures we feel for publication. But of course, on the other hand, we owe society to provide information, analysis, and recommendations on time and not years after the problem has occurred, especially when it's such a global issue. And this is a difficult path between a rock and a hard place, I am aware. But what this means is that we must reflect on our role as social scientists in such times of crisis, and perhaps take the time to see how we can actually be useful before writing something. Another aspect that emerges is that we as a community constructed a series of instruments to assess, to monitor, and to understand the crisis. And this from questionnaires and new qualitative systems to understand the coping mechanism, to quantitative models assessing the impact of various lockdown strategies, as shown by Marc Florbet in his keynote. A question arises is, were these instruments actually used by those in charge, those in command of organizations or government or locally in NGOs, etc.? My fear is that a politically correct answer would be, it is difficult to assess how much they were used. And this again questions our relation to the actors and the decision makers and how social science is actually involved in decision making. Perhaps we should look closer at how medicine has managed to be more influential and involved into decision making. Another reflection that we can have is as follows. If we had been prepared to conduct research in situation of crisis, for example, by having pre-approved ethics board clearance for research, pre-recorded protocols for publication, agreements for data collection with existing panels and various organizations. By having pre-organized international and interdisciplinary networks already operational, well, we would have been much better off to produce quality research fast and avoid half-baked research. And in this respect, what Marewa Glover from New Zealand suggested, based on her very candid and instructive analysis of the challenges they met in their international study, is a very nice paper and food for thought for all of us. So looking back now at what just happened is also a way to look forward and to prepare the future. Indeed, this COVID crisis, I think, is only one in a growing series of global crises coming onto us with what we gently call the big transitions ahead, climatic, ecological, economic, social, possibly also technical crisis, and also more pandemics. And some crises, probably most crises, will combine several dimensions. So we shall again, and likely often, have to work in these critical conditions of disrupted institutions and impeached normal practices. We must prepare for that and set up instruments, practices, networks, rules, formats that are agile, resilient, responsive, transdisciplinary, international, and capable to provide robust analysis and advice to those in charge and to the public. That's what they're expecting from us scientists. This is a new way of doing science that will have some aspects of action research, probably. But action research was usually local, right? And here we need something global. We have to invent this. And in this perspective, we should analyze the COVID-19 crisis as sort of a natural experiment that will enable social science and science in general to get to this next level of fitness that we need to face the global challenges ahead. WPRN is typically an instrument of that new generation of science during transitions, but we need more such installations, right? We need a new culture of doing science during transitions. We need a science that addresses transitions also. In a word, we need a science of transitions, to use the phrase coined by Helga Nowotny in a recent discussion that we had. And so may I start the panel by handing over to her to maybe advocate for a science of transition and perhaps situate this in the larger framework of research policies, which she knows so well for all the positions that she holds in our institutions. And then Olivier Bouin perhaps can talk about each, the European Alliance for Social Sciences, the role it can play and the state of the current community regarding such a project. And of course, of his experience as WPRN lead coordinator. And Maxi Heitmayer could make a short summary of what kind of research WPRN brought up, how WPRN 21 differs from other conferences, and what we can learn from all that experience. And then we can go to questions and discussion with the audience to see where we go from here. Helga, please.
Thank you very much, Saadi, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. And as you rightly said, you know, new ideas come up in talking to each other. And what I have to say and want to share with you tonight is a sort of continuation of the ongoing conversation. But I would like to make 3 points. The first point is the role of the social sciences during the crisis, before and after. The second point concerns how to position the social sciences and social science research in the wider field, both with relation to other sciences, but also with regard to society, policy, decision makers. And finally, you know, some initial ideas of what a science of transition would have to face in order to make any progress at all. Now, the role of science during the crisis is something you have discussed today, and sorry that I could not participate, but Maxi was very kind enough to share some of his observations with me. But we should be clear that if we look at what happens after the crisis, in reality means before the next crisis. So there is a kind of temporal continuity, a kind of continuum that has waves. We were speaking about waves of infections, but there are waves, there are breaks, there are some reversal, there is a déjà vu, etc. In other words, I would focus less on impact and more on the dynamics. And the dynamics are difficult to capture, but they consist in these different temporal fluctuations in the way how we seem to go forward, but at the same time, we make one step forward, two steps backwards, but then, you know, there are other things that are happening. And dynamics also means that we have to see how things are interrelated. Now, it is known, and most likely, you know, the virus, as happens with many of viruses, jumped from animals, whether they were bats or ferrets or whatever, on humans. But we have to be very clear that the space, the natural habitat for many of these animals is becoming more and more restricted due to demographic pressure. So in other words, animals are moving closer in, living with us, and because we are expanding the habitat of humans. And this means, you know, the origin of virus transmission is a very good example for the kind of interaction that we have to face. It's biology, it's environment, it's human demography, it's the way how we build our habitat and the little space we leave for, you know, animals, unless we put the elephants somewhere in Africa into a reservoir. Otherwise, the world becomes more crowded. But we also see the interconnectedness if we turn towards cities, because the structure of a city, the density in different quarters, the way how houses are being built, architects are discussing, you know, what should more space for home offices mean for future architecture, etc. Again, shows how social inequalities are tightly connected with the kind of mostly urban structures, but of course you also have rural structures, and how this all plays together. And at the same time, you can observe that density also means you have certain forms of density where social interactions are transformed into social communities that prove to be quite resilient. And again, you know, we have to reach a better understanding of how these social interactions work. Then there is the connectedness of a globalizing world with transportation, with migration, and this will certainly continue also in the future. And last but not least, the role of digitalization. And the digital technologies had a very interesting impact on us, because on the one side, they were extremely beneficial in saving us from being socially completely isolated. And on the other hand, we can see how they pushed us further and accelerated the push towards digitalization. Now, the title of our discussion is also Lessons Learned. And I would say, first of all, it's not so easy to draw lessons. And it's not easy because, precisely because we are faced with a global situation. This means, however clever we are in doing our research, in our observations, we find ourselves in different places at different times, different conditions, and yet, and Saadi alluded to this already, everything happens at the same time. So we have a simultaneity, which is part of the global world, but at the same time, we as observers, as researchers, have one particular perspective because we are bound, we cannot oversee everything, we are bound to one place at one time. We can start to compare, we start to compare, but nevertheless, we have to make space if we want to draw lessons for this multiple perspectives and the simultaneity of what is happening, while at the same time being aware we only see one partial perspective given of where we are at which moment in time, and as I said, there is this dynamics, and also under which conditions. But if there is one lesson to be drawn and to be learned, I would say that the social sciences have to orient themselves much more towards these global perspectives, and its perspectives in the plural. So let me now move on to the second point, how to position the social sciences and social science research in view of being better prepared for the next time. Now, of course, I can only support what Saadi said. You know, you need networks, you have to strengthen existing networks, you need to build new infrastructures. There have to be preparations, protocols were mentioned. So all this is part of how to build a kind of network and global social science infrastructure around the world. But at the same time, I would say, even if our focus is on the social sciences, we are not alone. We are not the only ones. And therefore, I think we have to start to build alliances. And in retrospect, it's also clear to the medical people that had they listened and brought in some social science knowledge from the beginning, things might have turned out otherwise. You can say the same thing about policy making. One way of making a lockdown effective was to close the offices, which meant that parents had to remain at home with their children. Now, this in turn had effects on the children. So you have these kind of chains of events and consequences and the web of interactions again here, where I think the social sciences would be well advised to build alliances with people working in public health, notably, but also with regard to schools. We can see now that the topic of mental health is cropping up for students at universities. I hear this for young researchers around the world. Mental health, but of course also for adolescents in particular, and we don't really know. Children are quite resilient, but what it will mean for them in the future. And then, of course, we need to line up with the people who work with data, who make modelings, be it for prognosis, be it to test the effectiveness of policy measures. All this would need much more social science input than has happened in the past. Now, we should not say from the beginning we are not asked. We have something to offer. And I feel very often it's up to us to make the first move, to make the first steps, to say, what is it we have to offer? And I think the social sciences have to offer a unique combination of being able to observe and analyze what is happening right now. Because you can take surveys, you can have participant observation. There are social science methods that allow you to capture, so to say, on the spot what is happening. And at the same time, the social sciences have a long-term perspective because we know we're dealing with social structures. And these are long-term, kind of constraints or enabling devices, also infrastructures that allow you to say something about generations, about biographies, about life course, about future effects, etc. And I think it's this unique combination of analyzing and immediate observations and a long-term view. So I have to just take a sip of water. So therefore, I think if we start to develop some kind of strategy, how to make this first move and build an alliance with other scientific communities. This would indeed be helpful, but we have to be the ones who make it explicit what we have to offer. And I think the social sciences, as is shown now, because also others are asking themselves what lessons can be drawn, and there is a very clear admission that had we used social science knowledge earlier, we would have all been better off. Let me turn now towards, the science of transition is a big word, but what I mean by this is the following. First of all, the social sciences, they are really about social change. Whether you look at sociology, where social change is everywhere, whether you look at economics or at anthropology, we are used to deal with social change, but it's a kind of implicit way how we deal with it. We don't, we take it almost for granted. Society is about changing all the time. So social change is something that paradoxically we take for granted. But, and this is something that is perhaps peculiar to the social sciences, we tend to be much more normative than other sciences with regard to social change. And therefore, when we observe, analyze social change, we are very often quick in our normative judgment. It's good, it's not good, why is it good, why is it not good? And, it's an understandable urge. But if we want to better understand how transitions actually happen, we should, the normative judgment should come in later and not at the very beginning. Because to understand the how, we can link up also to a number of topics that are sort of the normal way of dealing with social change. We have a micro level, we have a macro level. We don't quite understand how the two are related in bringing about change, but we know change happens at the micro level of social interactions, it happens at the macro level, and something happens in between. We don't know quite what, but it's there. We also know that there are social movements that typically have some kind of, beginning, sometimes very unexpected. Social movements form around grievances, around, some kind of normative demands, whatever. And then they gather force, they rise to a certain peak, but then, they tend to go down, decline. And this has been studied, so there's a lot of research on that. But how exactly it happens, what are the mechanisms, the triggers? And some social movements transform themselves into something else. They become institutions even. If you think of the workers' movement back in the 19th century, that ended up in trade unions, etc., etc. So you have transformations, some just fade and you never hear of them again unless you are a historian digging in archives or historical records. And so it's nothing that we are not familiar with, but we have to take a new look at what we know quite well and ask ourselves, how does it actually happen? And only then, I would say, should we pose the normative question, how can we help to orient the transition in certain directions that we think are the directions our society should move, rather than asking the question right in the beginning. So these are some of the elements that I think would help us to move forward here, and pulling on the one hand together what we already know, but reconceptualizing it and asking which exactly are the mechanisms, what happens when and what happens afterwards, and what exactly is being transformed, and what does a transition to a new state actually entail? How does it impact people, institutions? Where does the new arise? Because transition also means you need new institutions. And one of the malaise we have, whether we speak about the digital transformation or the green transformation, is if you think of regulation that must play a major role in the direction we want these transitions to go, we are discovering that the institutions we have been set up 50, 100 years ago. If you think of monopolies in the US, I mean, the legislation goes back to the last century even, and they cannot capture what a platform economy actually means and the kind of regulation you would need. The same holds for digitalization. I mean, we all are aware regulation is important, and again here, the normative has to enter at this point, but the institutions are not there. So I think thinking about transition also means we have to be much more attentive to what kind of institutions do we need today. And historically, it's not quite clear, who invented the institutions that we have, that we use without thinking much about it. And yet, we are really challenged to come up also with new institutions as an answer how normatively we want the transition to move in certain directions and prevent them from going into another direction.
Well, thank you very much, Helga. I can only approve. I mean, this poses very directly the issues of regulation, and it would be interesting to pose it with a good scientific background of what's out there and what's needed. I think this is wise. Olivier, in charge of a large institution, by the way.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, it's always difficult to talk after Helga. Not only because she says so many good things, but usually she already says what you intend to tell, more or less. So and also because like it's 6:30 and there have been 2 long days. I'll try to be really short and really try to concentrate on how, because I think we can all agree with what Helga said in a sense, and I won't give the first points of my talk because that's basically what Helga just very well and as usual elegantly presented. I think what we need to look at is how to actually implement what we are just talking about, not only like science of transitions, but and it's something that we've been discussing with Saadi, with Helga, with Marc Florbet, with here as well, was a speaker today. We've been trying to figure out how can we collaborate and how can we collaborate and make scientific dialogue or scientific exchange in the 21st century, and how can we improve, in a sense, better, and what would be the role of SSH into all this? And I can make reference maybe in the talk to not only the WPRN, the World Pandemic Research Network that we launched with Saadi a year and a half ago, but also to the initiative, the International Panel on Social Progress, that with Mark and Helga and some of the speakers today, Raouf Boussekine and others, and Saadi, we've kind of promoted since 2014, in a sense. And what we have to put together, in a sense, are not only, you know, the injunction, the willingness or the imperative to work together, but how we can do it. Because networks, on the one hand, is part of the solution. Tools and formats are part of the solution. Institutions, here I mean organizations, not necessarily, I would say, regulations, but like organizations or research institutions have to step in. And what we need to do, in a sense, if we want to go forward, as I think it's the idea of this concluding roundtable, to go beyond, you know, not only COVID-19 and WPRN, but how can we actually create the cooperative space where we can put together disciplines, networks, tools, and I will get back to that, research institutions, funders together, so that we can actually move forward, because this has been around for you know, years. I'm an economist myself. I would not refer to Karl Polanyi, the Great Transformation, and so on. But this has been, you know, around, in a sense. What would be the role of social sciences and the humanities in this understanding of the big transitions? We're not talking, obviously, only about pandemics, as Saadi said, but we're talking about aging, we're talking about energy transition, we're talking about environmental challenges, we're talking about artificial intelligence, and even more complex, like the interactions between all these dimensions at a global level with democratic deliberation. So all this is, you know, with institutions, as Helga would put it. So the idea is how to actually get into, how can we make progress? Because the idea, we've been talking about multidisciplinarity, we've been talking about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity for like decades now, and still we, in the field of social sciences and humanities, have made less progress, in a sense, than maybe other sciences. Helga referred to medicine, and Saadi referred to, you know, nature and science and Medline and Zenodo, and in medical, in life sciences or in environmental sciences or physics, they've been more active in terms of collaborating, and we are not lagging behind. But in a sense, if we really want to make progress into this, I think, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches to these very complex societal challenges, we need to do our part, a little bit like what Helga said, and I would like to echo that. We need, as an SSH community or as SSH communities at a global level, we need to move, in a sense, forward. Because now I would say that society needs it. I would say that funders are ready now more than ever. And I would just take the example of Horizon Europe, this big program for 7 years, because we have like non-European people. So for us, it's kind of a common currency now. It's like the euro. We talk about Horizon Europe, but for our non-European colleagues, this is a big program, 100 billion euros over a 7-year time horizon, and 50% of this chunk of money, i.e. 50 billion euros, will be invested in tackling complex societal challenges. And in this new program that started in 2021, the willingness or the preparedness of the European Commission to support truly interdisciplinary responses to these societal challenges is much higher than it has ever been in the past. So in a sense, not only society needs it, but I would say that funders, like large funders like the European Union, but also national research agencies, large international foundations, they are pushing into that direction of how can we work together including social sciences and humanities, because now I think it's widely understood that these very complex, interdependent societal challenges cannot be dealt with without a strong input of the social sciences and the humanities. But now the question is how? How can we actually do that? And I think here that we, in a sense, need to do our part, in a sense, in social sciences and humanities, and try to develop the platforms, the tools, the formats, the instruments that we need, in a sense, to gather in order to be able to work, first of all, together, because SSH is a very large and diverse, I would say, research community. And yesterday, Elisa Reis was telling us that, you know, she had the impression, and also Gail Levi was in part of one of the roundtable, said we had the impression that economics kind of won the game against sociology and political science. But I think we need to work together. It doesn't work like this, but we need to work together, and we need to find the right tools and instruments and formats in order to be able to work. Otherwise, this will be rehashing the same thing again and again and again. And I think what we've been trying to do, at least with WPRN, but also with the International Panel on Social Progress, with like you know, different formats that I will come to that in my conclusion, but different support for scientific research that would be international, interdisciplinary, and innovative. And I think what we need, in a sense, because we're talking a lot about collective intelligence and how we can promote collective intelligence, I think the idea would be to make converge like all the knowledge about the good initiatives, the good programs, the good tools, the good formats, the good platforms, so that at least we have a kind of a panoptic vision of what are the tools that are currently used by SSH communities to work together or to work across the aisle. I would like to say something that is very common in the US, to work with the other part of the plane, in a sense, with life sciences, with environmental sciences, with data sciences, and so on. And I think we need, because we know that there are a lot of initiatives, programs, tools, formats around kind of blossoming, but we need to take stock of what is going on, and maybe at some point, and I don't know what research institution at the global level, will it be the International Science Council? Will it be with the help of some large funders at the European level or at the more global level, or the NSF or whatever? But I think at some point we will have to choose some standards that would make the community being able to work together and with others, I would say in science, not to talk of the very important aspects of intersectorality, to work with industry and with civil society organizations and so on, but we're just concentrating on how to make science in the 21st century and how to create the channels for SSH to be an active contributor. And for this, we need to really work on these formats and on these programs and initiatives that could really bring together the possibility to work with other sciences in order to tackle these complex societal challenges. And we need databases. We need, and WPRN was the very first attempt to do that, and said, well, we know, and Maxi yesterday mentioned that when Zhang Xiaopo made his conference, gave his talk yesterday. He was a fellow in Paris, and he had this questionnaire on the impact of COVID-19 on 10,000 small and medium-sized enterprises. And we said, okay, this will take place everywhere in every country. There will be surveys, there will be questionnaires to see the impact of COVID-19 on small and medium-sized enterprises. Can we just try to avoid what Saadi referred as half-baked research and try to cooperate and work together in order to be able to deliver better research, more timely and stronger research? And I think we need this type of databases. We need formats for meetings, and this flip conference is an attempt to do something in COVID times, but we need also scientific accompaniment. We need pre-publications formats. We need to push for this continuum of tools that will make us more prepared and more ready to work with other sciences, because we know a lot of, and Helga more than everyone else in this panel, because she has been around over the past decades pushing for the contribution of SSH into interdisciplinary research to tackle complex societal challenges. But if we really want to go forward, we need to, identify the best formats and at some point try to diffuse them and disseminate them. And for this, and I will conclude on this, we need really to at the same time to have partners, because we cannot do that by ourselves, because we have seen with Marc and Helga the limitations of the International Plan Social Progress. We gathered 350 social scientists. We published 4 books at Cambridge University Press, but the impact was really limited, and it did not become a standard for our disciplines. WPRN is a very nice initiative, but we proposed over the past year with Saadi and with Antoine, other institutions to use this type of platform to gather knowledge and current research and so on. And we've had only very limited success. And when I check as the president or the former president of the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities, I see only one community or SSH community that's been able to gather itself for energy with the project like Shape and Shift that gathers most of the energy scholars in social sciences and humanities. But that's one, I would say it's a counterexample of what we have not been able to do so far. So we need to find partners into this in order to scale up, because what we do, and I think many others do not reach this kind of scale that would have a kind of a more global impact, that's something, or a larger impact. But B, as Helga said, we also need to innovate. And usually the partners are really conventional in their approaches. So so you need to balance the need to partner in order to have impact and to scale up with, and we know that these type of innovations about, scientific formats, scientific accompaniment, pre-publication meetings, databases, communications, conferences will take place in innovative spaces. And innovative spaces such as like Institute for Advanced Studies, for example, and they in a sense they need to partner with more conventional I would say and larger institutions and organizations in order to be able to experiment at a larger scale the type of collaborative science we would like to see develop in the 21st century with a strong input of SSH. So I think we need to be very concrete, and what I would call for in a sense is that we use our different channels and we create a platform where we would list first or give links to the best and most innovative initiatives in terms of interdisciplinarity involving SSH in tackling societal challenges. This does not exist. And we can reach out to the groups that have already had this idea in mind, but did it on a very small scale. And what we need to do in a sense is to compile that, to have a kind of panoptic vision of an understanding of what are the most important and innovative initiatives, and then try to work together and then try to collaborate, but among those who are the innovators and who actually understand the need to scale up their initiatives in order to have a stronger impact.
Well, thank you, Olivier. I mean, that's a concrete suggestion, definitely.
At 10 to 7, we have to be concrete.
Indeed. Maxi.
Yes. Well, I could not say actually that it's hard to talk after Saadi, after Helga, after Olivier. But I actually have the pleasure to do a bit of a walk through my memory palace and share some of the thoughts and ideas that stuck with me throughout the conference. This is, of course, a very grateful position because I myself don't need to be smart or insightful, but I rather can feed forward the smartness and the insightfulness of the community. And I'd also like to make it quick so we have some discussion. So to start us off, one of the first observation was made by Saadi, actually, that we managed to finish our welcome, the first agenda point, on time. And so he suggested, and it generally appeared that with remote meetings, people seem to be incredibly punctual. Did we manage to keep this throughout the conference? Let's say we did okay. I might be guilty of several moments where we struggled and we moved so let's say moments of transgression. But I would like to juxtapose this with the comment by Olivier at the end of the first day, actually after we ended the recording, noting that there's this common sentiment that the interesting conversations usually take place after the session. And so I hope that this panel managed and will manage actually to emulate this feeling of a session after the session. Enough of preamble. So I think Raouf Boussikin started us off with a comment, right? After wars, we sometimes see instances of quick recovery and rebuilding, and he referred to the German and Japanese economic miracle, and that we do not often observe this after the Spanish flu or other epidemics. So I thought this is an interesting thought to keep in mind, something to be realistic about as well. He had also mentioned as COVID as a potential gift to later generations, and this is a quote, with lower levels of world population. So I think there's also looking for opportunity in adversity. In a panel on news and media, we've pointed out very clearly the differences in the information that, for example, newspaper readers and social media users received affect the information around vaccines and also the speed of information. So the different speeds that sub-pockets within the society operates on are very important as well. We've also been reminded that the COVID crisis has taken precedence over another crisis that's going on, the refugee crisis, and that there are many problematic positions towards migrants and so on. So there also are forgotten crises within crises. In terms of masks and compliance, we've heard actually about the masked effects of COVID and the negative externalities it creates also for the environment. We saw massive changes in shopping habits, perhaps on a happier note, also sales in pet supplies doubled. So this is very nice. At the other time, of course, we saw that a lot of lockdown puppies are now being adopted. So we create a lot of negative externalities. We also saw throughout the panel and throughout these 2 days that the poor have been affected disproportionately, as always. And they also depend more than others on society and community, which has been torn apart, basically. I wanted also to reference the comment that Olivier mentioned earlier about from Gal Levy, that economists seem to have won over the sociologists. So this is one that really stuck out, I think, as well. On that note, the panel chair, Trina Orai, she commented on also maybe the need that we should reflect on this narrative that we had at the beginning of the lockdown. We're all in this together. Are we, and can we maybe see differences in the levels of togetherness? Xiaobo Zhang then talked about cluster regions around how the periphery seems to be hit harder than the center and how online seem to be better than offline. So again, we have vulnerable populations being hit more, or the expected groups, let's say, hit more. And maybe as an antidote to the Ted Bloch-Tenzulidis suggested that resilience is actually something that should be taken into account by city planners and by policymakers. So the spaces and the environment, the built environment around us is something as well that needs to be resilient. I think another very striking point as well, that he said the analogy of vaccines as seat belts is actually a very bad one, because this is something that affects you. He rather said that if we want to use a sort of an automobile metaphor, we should be likening it to driving on the highway without the headlights turned on. So really creating negative externalities. Elisa Rice has then spoken about how COVID has interacted with the culture of poverty in deprived neighborhoods in Brazil. And this feeds back to the earlier discussion that we had, or to the earlier observation that we're in this paradoxical situation that the community is being disintegrated, yet the community is needed to create community-based solutions and to provide support. So again, this is something that we always need to keep in mind when we think about institutions. These societal institutions that we have, they also need to be moved and pushed in towards the 21st century. Marc Flobé then talked about lockdowns, and I thought there was a very nice quote: a stricter lockdown with stricter thresholds is always better in terms of inequality. The question then is, how do we communicate this to the people? How do we communicate this if we have very unfortunate and very dire news that we need to be strict? Another comment in the same way was if you want to be ambitious with your policies, you'd better be ambitious on all fronts. And I think this is what we've been trying here, and also something that hopefully all of us can agree on. We saw in Ben and Kleinberg's talk that seems to be a 50-50 split in the population between those who are well coping and those who have resignated. And I think this is quite striking, that we have so many people who can be characterized as actually being resignated, and that will be difficult to touch and to reach with policies. We've also heard in the panel on marginalized communities that in many places, the default assumption was that disabled people would just be affected more than non-disabled people. And therefore, in the end, this became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they actually were more affected and more overlooked because proactive policies weren't put into place. Saadi, you had then mentioned also as well that scientists were not as well prepared. They were engaging with new institutions. They had to engage with them. They had to come up with things on the spot. So like the government and like the police would have contingency plans. Maybe a question for us would be how the scientific community could come up with contingency plans and with better preparations for the future. And this, of course, ties in with what Helga and Olivier have just had. Now, in terms of local context and the economic policy we've discussed, we actually, and I think Patrick is still here, we have a silver lining, and actually for the next crisis, we may have better instruments, better indexes, better opportunities of measuring and learning already, which is something to look forward to. Unfortunately, we've also heard that a lot of the political message that we're trying to share, and this was by Nick Bird, they don't really matter. So we didn't really find a difference between sort of textual data, flatten the curve, giving numbers, or more emotional stuff, a picture of someone in the ICU. At the end of the day, this seemed to depend on personal preferences. And here we go back to the social institutions, of course, right? It's not just the brick and mortar things that we need to change, but also the social ones. Finally, Enrique Fates then reminded us that it's actually not enough to just raise expectations from the government and raise expectations and belief in the government if we at the same time destroy trust in science when we want to increase adherence to social norms. And this can actually be undermined and weaponized almost by other actors now that use this blind trust in science, perhaps, to make information appear more scientific. So we're in a double bind there. Finally, in our panel about coping, we've heard many interesting things about the more lighthearted ways, such as humor or stepping away from the problem for a while, but also the more serious sides of day-to-day life, mental health, and even coping with loss and grievance. So let me conclude by saying, overall, there seems to be an agreement that having resources ready and accessible seems to be the way forward. And many teams all over the globe have begun to create these resources. We've had many interesting resources shared on the day throughout the last 2 days. And it's important that we take good care of these resources, develop them further, and make sure we're ready for the next crisis. From what I've seen, I think from hopefully what we've all seen over the last 2 days, WPRN 21 and the WPRN network seems to be a great meta resource, if you will, where we can collect these resources and make them widely accessible to the community. And with this, I believe it's now appropriate to finally enter into discussion and to hear from the community. So thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Maxi. Maybe the audience might have some comments or questions. So I would open the floor to a larger discussion.
I think we'll use the typical raise hand function again. If you could just raise your hand and then you can go ahead.
Unmute before.
Yes, Marc.
Yes, thank you very much for these interesting talks. I want to start by congratulating WPRN. I think it's not just a great effort in building some cooperative institution. It's also a great effort at living up to the social responsibility of academics in a situation of crisis. I wanted to ask a bit more about transition science, which is indeed something very important because transitions are always difficult for many people. And Saadi mentioned the hard question about the role of SSH in terms of influence on policymaking and various actors. And Helga pleaded for alliances across regions of the world, but also across disciplines. And Olivier went in the same direction. But I was wondering, you didn't say much about alliances or ways of interacting with actors. Should we also make the first step in that direction? I know that Olivier has great ideas now how to do that, but I'd be curious to hear from all of you if you think about whether we should not only make a first step toward other disciplines, toward our colleagues to build more cooperative institutions like WPRN, but whether we should also build institutions of ways of cooperating with actors so that transitions, we can learn from them and transitions would happen more smoothly, and maybe also they would listen more to what we have to offer them.
Olivier?
Helga wants to talk first, but then I can go on this.
Go
You
ahead.
go first, Helga.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
Go
no, very quickly, Mark, that's kind of also ongoing discussion that we have, because we plan on launching IPSP 2.0, the International Panel on Social Progress 2.0, also learning from the I would say the limitations of the first exercise, even though we've been successful in gathering, as I said before, 350 social scientists, and we produce kind of a massive report, like a bit like IPCC back in 1990. I think we need to take into account how to scale up and how to have impact. And I think both are equally important. Mark, as you know, I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done in order to implement multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinary research. And we know that it's a kind of a buzzword around, but it's difficult to actually implement it. And on the other hand, like opening to actors, and whether you call that intersectorality or outreach or whatever, I think is extremely important. But I think we need to embed, and not only to be in the logic of transfer, but trying maybe to get the actors on board at an early stage. But this even, I would say, increase the difficulty or the complexity of the initiative, because if you work with other colleagues from other sciences and also involve civil society actors or doers within at an early stage, I spent 10 years at the OECD trying to have policymakers, researchers, and industry work together. You just increase the complexity of this, and we have modelers here, so like Patrick and yourself. So I won't get into this, but if you increase the complexity with many variables, then it's very. I think it is even more difficult to move forward. But I think these are very important dimensions to have in mind. And I think in the feedback that we could get on the innovative formats, I think people from outside research could also bring, I think, very interesting initiatives or programs or formats they've been experiencing. And I will put, based on a side exchange with Simon, Luc, we will propose 2 acronyms. One is much nicer, that is WIN, World Interdisciplinary Network, or mine, which is less nice. It's a hub for innovative interdisciplinary initiatives. But I think we need at some point, first of all, I think, and I would just end on this, I think we need to gather the information. If we want to go anywhere close to what you said, Helga, about a research infrastructure, whether it would be at national level or European level. We know that there's a lot of funding for European research infrastructures, or at the global scale. First of all, we need to take stock of what are the good initiatives, the good formats, because we know that a lot of colleagues have been moving in the same direction, but we have only a piecemeal approach. We know only what we know in our networks. And what we need, in a sense, is to gather and give visibility to this, because as we learn also from IPSP, there's a lot that has already been done and tested, and we need, in a sense, to not replicate, but inspire ourselves from the initiatives that have worked well somewhere else, and maybe, follow, in a sense, and adapt what you need to do. And I think that's something that would be kind of a very concrete step towards putting all the people who've been trying to move forward on the same hub, in a sense, so that they can look at what are the initiatives that have been undertaken, so that we can have like collective, momentum, in a sense, by saying, okay, that's great, but IPSP could take something out of WPRN, that could take something out of a network of funders, and then we could maybe make progress, because we need to get concrete.
Yes, okay, I agree with what has been said, but let me go back to Mark and more concretely to IPSP. I have been puzzled, like all of us, why was the impact so far below our expectation? I would say what it should have deserved. And I think maybe one of the reasons was that we took the IPCC as a kind of model without having the governmental support or any other support. So we took the format without, having the bricks and bolts or whatever, the nuts and bolts of what it needs. And so I would prefer, along what has been said, gather information is obviously a first step, but I would like to move towards building these alliances, finding people as partners who are willing to innovate. And I would start with other disciplines, people in other disciplines that are interested in, which mechanisms are the ones moving a transition. This would be my question to them. And if you find people who are willing to join from other disciplines, then you can start to build a case. And from there on, you develop it further. So learning from IPSP, I would say, I would prefer to start bottom up on a small scale, but focusing on the question of science of transition. How do transitions happen? And what is the knowledge that is around? We are not starting from scratch at all, but we have to reconceptualize it and reconceptualize it in such a way that other people in other disciplines, can contribute. And by contributing, you keep on changing, you keep on developing, and you keep innovating. And then think, what are the next steps to be taken? So this would be my first approach.
Can I ask and maybe push back a little bit on this, because I think the idea is great, right? Something concrete, and we've had a couple of times we've heard, okay, this is something concrete that we move towards. I think we can probably all agree that because we've heard some great sums being talked about, but the problem is not monetary and financial resources that are underlying this, if I'm not mistaken. It seems that something else is missing, and this is what we've been labeling as concrete. But is there a specific metric that as we have? Because I think what we've been talking about effectively is something like community spirit, right? And I'm not really sure that the concrete takeaway that we can come with here, say, okay, we've produced something concrete, we should just all connect more and interact with each other more and build this community spirit. I don't think this is something that we can actually measure and try to move forward. So are there other types of necessarily data, but firmer points that we could collect, that we could say, this is a way how we can actually see that SSH is moving into a direction that other scientific communities are moving towards?
If I may, I mean, the issue here is not that we're not motivated to do this, but we have a series of very serious incentives for career that go completely against this kind of collaboration. So roughly at the moment, when you do interdisciplinary work, and when you try to wait and do something proper, and that is in a format that is acceptable by users, decision makers or what, you get away from what is currently rewarded for a career. And so, I mean, that's okay if you're old folks like me, I mean, whose career is behind, and you don't really have to care about this. But I mean, the forces of the people who are at early career, there is no serious incentive for that. And it's complicated because we need to create also a system of sustainable careers and living for people who are doing this, right? And at the moment, even though there's goodwill everywhere, including in the commission and in the funders, we have not yet found something that rewards, in terms of science, interdisciplinary work of high quality and efficiency. And as long as we don't have that, we have put in place incentives that go against the common interest of everyone. We're trying to think on how to address these issues at the Press Institute for Advanced Studies, but also in various networks. And it's difficult because it means that we need a transition also of our disciplinary system, which grounds the whole academia. It's not easy. And what Olivier suggests is, let us look at people who have managed to solve locally these issues and make that an example and sort of stamp it as, this is how we should do, this is what works, right? Because there doesn't seem to be, at this point, we're so much stuck in the previous box of how to think these things that we are incapable of designing a system. But I'm sure that a lot of people locally have had great initiatives that work. And first we have to show examples of another way of doing this is possible, and then we build on this. So Olivier's suggestion is very empirical, but remember that science always started with empirica, right?
Well, we are not the only ones who about shaking up the reward and recognition system in science. There are a number of initiatives going on. So this helps us, but I would really encourage Olivier because of the global perspective. So you have opportunities that others, that stay within, let's say, the Western system of how, careers are being promoted, etc. Once you start to move outside to that, you get fresh ideas. And you get examples that perhaps, can be brought in with some adaptations, etc. But I would not be so pessimistic as Saadi sounded, because I can see, I was listening this morning to from the Young Academy of Europe. And, they also have an ongoing discussion and project why science needs to change its recognition and reward system. Yeah. So the young people know something has to change, something has to give. And I also find it encouraging that UPRI, the UK research funding institution, now is changing the standard CV. And there will be a narrative CV, and there will be 4 different areas where you can speak about your contributions. One contribution is to knowledge, obviously. Another contribution is support to other people. Another contribution is support to, working cooperation with other stakeholders and so on. So, these are criteria that are opening up new areas, and UCRI being the major funding organization in the UK will have an impact. And they will have the power to insist, now you write these narratives, which are part, of course, of the CV. You cannot only just write a narrative. I've been supporting, my PhD students or whatever it is. But it's a convergence, and it comes from many different parts. And so I think it would be good, Olivier, if you could see, what is happening outside of Europe and the US. And, there are interesting examples to get away from this you either have scientific excellence or you have relevance. I mean, this is no longer tenable.
Yeah, Helga, you know, Saadi is always the most pessimistic around, but then he's a kind of the that's the problem of you know, that Zinoviev put you know, between the optimist and the pessimist. He's a kind of an optimist pessimist. Optimistic pessimist. His nickname was the Dark Prophet of Doom. So that's why he's always looking at the at the dark side of the things, you know, to move the things forward. No, but I think the time is ripe to do what we're doing, because if you take, I 100% agree with you, Helga, that we need to go also outside Europe and so on. But like Europe is moving on open science. You know this better than anyone else. But on open science, on open air, on the fact that they're moving towards the more fluidity, to take Saadi's you know, reference. If you look, so they're moving in a sense in order to promote, and Europe is still a very strong player in science globally. And so the fact that they're sending strong signals that we should go for open pre-publications and open publications that will be accessible to the entire community and not be locked in, you know, pay for read articles in selected journals. I think this is a major trend from the Commission, and this is something that will stay and will impact research. So beyond the fact that there's a strong push for integration or embeddedness of social sciences and humanities into, I would say, interdisciplinary research, I think there are other streams of change that would make such initiatives, I think, really welcome. So as a kind of a takeaway, maybe message or initiative out of this first WPRN conference, the idea to try to gather the existing knowledge that is disseminated, and I'm sure that even across the screen here, from Aruna to Patrick to Alice or Marcus was waiting, I'm sure that there are good initiatives and good formats that have been experienced, and we should first of all make them available and known, so that we can replicate, adapt them, and then create coalitions for change.
And this is a good transition. Other questions than just the panelists, please. This is an open discussion. So what's your feeling? And I'm aware of time, so we will not stay for very much longer because it's the end of the week. But we wouldn't like to stop before you had a chance to air your questions and opinions. Aruna and Patrick. Aruna.
I have a comment because I'm trying to, and also I'm feeling very guilty that I missed my own chance to speak, but I tried to compensate that attending other panels. And at the last conclusion, I mean, this final panel, I'm trying to see, like, you know, even though we are coming from different places and we are presenting different contexts, and all are with respect to COVID, but I see so much synergy, even though they're coming from, say, economics or say this coping. Basically, it's the same communities that we are talking about in different geographies who are grappling. So COVID somehow, even if you say that it is different countries or intersectionalities, I can somehow see that this COVID has creating an opportunity to see things at the same level. And I think we should document this, because 50 years down the line, this is going to be something that people will, it could be a public health, it could be policy making, it could be anything, but this will be something like, okay, we had created this kind of a synergy or a synchrony across the globe for a thing, for communities together. So this is a comment just to say that I see a huge opportunity to come together. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Yeah. As Atrina said in one of the panels, I mean, we now understand for real that we're all in this together, right? Whether we want it or not. And so until now, reality hadn't, of globalization maybe had not hit each of us individually so hard in the face. And that at least has a silver lining. Patrick.
Yes, thank you. So, a quick comments. And first, I would like to thank the organizers, of course, and apologies if I could not attend as much as I wanted to the workshop. But just a quick remark on, I'm very glad that open science was mentioned a moment ago, because I think this is really, this is not only about, open data, open knowledge, it's also about how do we assess careers, and how do we assess, vitas. And I think part of the success of your initiative is to redesign what we mean by research. So research, because this is not obvious in the social science and humanities community, I think, because I think Olivier or Saadi, you mentioned before life sciences, for instance, but usually projects are really collective on a much larger scale than what we are used to in social sciences. So we are talking about teams that are composed of tens of people, and that's something. And I think I can see the open science movement in terms of how do you evaluate people's vitas when it comes to promotion or hiring. So there is this moving away from metrics to more narrative applications, but there's also a collective element. I think we really need also to assess the sort of collective part of the project, and now we can see people, especially doing interdisciplinary research, in which the collective aspects are very important, and it's not. So that's number one. So the collective projects should be really our goal, I think. And number two, my inclination when I think about interdisciplinarity is that the good way to go is really to put sort of research objects on the table. So we want to. That's what we want to start with, and from that perspective, you would like, ideally there is an unlimited number of disciplines that you want to gather, because if you start thinking in terms of objects, and the objects we are talking about are very complex, because we mentioned transition sciences, but those sciences are sciences of complexity, sciences of uncertainty, and I think it's very important that we can somehow also put social sciences and humanities within a broader spectrum of disciplines, because again, I don't know, I take a random example which is far from our own research, but mobility of the future. Mobility of the future would bring together disciplines that are come from very different parts of science, and a priori you don't want to restrict the disciplines that you want to bring given the research objects, and to me that's also very challenging, because somehow you want also to design, for instance, if you design a call for projects, ideally you would like to start with research objects again without any restriction a priori, because you want our communities to be able to define themselves, what are the consortia that they want to bring. So what I'm saying here is that it's a little bit disorganized, but I think the collective dimension, number one, and the fact that we don't want to restrict the number of disciplines in a given project are two important dimensions, I think.
Well, thank you very much.
Saadi, if I may say, that's exactly what the Institute for Advanced Study are supposed to do, in a sense, to promote this collaborative dimension and to promote a kind of interdisciplinary space to incubate projects, really, this is something. And again, Helga is the mother of many, institutes for advanced study in Europe and elsewhere, and we've been following a lead in a sense over the past 10 years. But these are, Patrick, I 100% agree with you both on the collaborative dimension and I would say on the blue sky nature. At the beginning, you have a research object and you want to restrict yourself to something, to 2 or 3 disciplines in an existing format. You need to have this, time and space and accompaniment so that you can really push it to the limits. And I think that's really why I was mentioning that if we want to move forward, we need at some point, innovative spaces or innovative research organizations that can really take this on board. And you know, Imera in Marseille, for example, Patrick, it's what Raouf tried to do over the past 3 or 4 years. And I think we need these type of spaces. And this can become possibly kind of research infrastructures that promote interdisciplinary innovative research. But this is something that needs to be taken care of, because otherwise you talk about collaboration, you talk about blue sky, but at the end of the day, you deliver little. So you need to get the actual players that will help this process take place and develop.
Yeah, well, thank you, Olivier. Of course, I can only agree on what you said about institutes for advanced study. But Patrick gives us a very interesting opportunity for a transition to the publication system that we're trying to set forward. And maybe, Maxi, you can say something about this before we finally close this session, because I'm aware of time also. And some people, for them, it is very, very late, in the day. I'm thinking about Aruna, for example.
Yes.
Maxi.
Yes, I'll quickly take over. So we have all the information on our website. It's on the /conference in terms of publication. But what we're trying to do is, for those who actually have submitted a project, we very warmly invite you to submit something for publication in text. And we've specifically looked at different ways of doing this now, also following some input from Helga and Olivier. And we'll be offering 2 tracks, one that is a more traditional paper form, and one that is a short research note form. And we will do an open peer review that will have reviewers named and hopefully not shamed, but actually highlighted. And so this is a part of open science as well, and like making sure that some of the work that goes into reviewing and into giving comments is publicly visible as well. So for all of those projects, hopefully we'll see a lot of them actually in a written form that we will then publish through the Institute of Advanced Studies. For those who are interested in this, for those authors, we will be in touch in due time at the beginning of next week in terms of the procedures. But I think the more important communication was there will be publications, and we will try to do something in a more transitional way, in a maybe more future-facing way than a traditional double-blind peer review. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Maxi. So this is also an innovative approach to publication and to see how we can collaborate further. I would like now to formally close this WPRN 21 conference. That means that is closing the network or not the relation between each of you, and you can continue. But I am aware that we also have lives, and that it's important not just to do research, but to live in the world. And this is also how we are useful to everyone else around us. I would like to thank you all very, very much. I would like to thank first Maxi for this enormous work that he's been doing. And it's been really very, very smooth for a new innovative format. I would like to thank you speakers and panelists who managed to do so well with this new format, and I hope you were happy with it, and we are very proud of what you did as a matter of fact, because we think that this is really an example of what will be a good practice in this transition science that Helga named, even though we don't exactly know what it is yet, but we want to go in that direction. And I would like to end on a very positive note, even though as Olivier Bouin, I always see the glass half empty, and I'm a dark prophet of doom. And I mean, I was really impressed at how this conference brought in some fresh views and fresh formats and fresh science from places that we usually don't hear about because they're filtered out by the standard system. This is refreshing, promising, and it makes me really hopeful, and it's quite encouraging for the effort that you all have set up. And I would finally like to make a special mention for somebody who is behind the scene, Antoine Cordova, because he is the man behind all the sophisticated cloud-based IT that you see in WPRN. And digitization is something that has to be constructed, and we are very lucky to have somebody like that, so talented behind this instrument. And on this note, I would like to thank you again, all of you, and let's keep on with the good work. And I think we will manage to save the world, or at least manage to keep it acceptable. Have a great weekend wherever you are on your time zone, and stay safe. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.